The morning fog rolled off the Pacific Ocean like a gray blanket, wrapping around the Coronado Naval Base as if trying to hide the secrets that would soon unfold within its gates. Among the sea of muscular, battle-hardened candidates preparing for the most grueling military training on Earth, one figure stood out for all the wrong reasons. Sarah Chun appeared almost fragile in her pristine uniform, her 5'4" frame dwarfed by the towering warriors around her who looked like they'd been carved from granite and forged in combat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The other candidates barely glanced in her direction as they gathered for the first day of Basic Underwater Demolition, SEAL training, their dismissive attitudes as thick as the morning mist. Sarah's appearance suggested someone who belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than on a battlefield. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow managed to look too neat, too perfect for someone about to endure 6 months of hell, designed to break the strongest men alive. Commander Jake Morrison surveyed the assembled candidates with the cold satisfaction of a predator sizing up prey. At 48, he embodied everything the Navy SEALs represented in the public imagination. His chest bore rows of ribbons that told stories of classified operations in hostile territories, his weathered face mapped with lines earned through decades of service in the world's most elite fighting force. When his steely gray eyes settled on Sarah, his expression shifted from professional assessment to barely concealed disgust. The inclusion of women in SEAL training represented everything Morrison believed was wrong with the modern military. Political correctness had invaded the sacred halls of warrior culture, forcing compromises that he was certain would weaken the very foundation of American special operations. Sarah's presence felt like a personal insult to every SEAL who had earned their trident through blood, sweat, and absolute dedication to standards that shouldn't be lowered for anyone. During the initial briefing, Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted his own superiority or questioned the natural order that placed him at the top of the military hierarchy. His words were carefully chosen to establish dominance while remaining technically within the bounds of military professionalism, though everyone present understood the underlying message about who belonged and who didn't. Sarah sat in the back row of the briefing room, her posture relaxed but alert in a way that suggested complete awareness of her surroundings without obvious effort. While other candidates shifted nervously or attempted to project confidence through aggressive body language, she remained perfectly still, absorbing information with the kind of focused attention that comes naturally to those who have learned that missing details can mean the difference between life and death. The apartment Sarah rented just outside the base reflected the same understated efficiency as her demeanor. Sparse furnishings served functional purposes without revealing anything about personal preferences or emotional attachments. No photographs decorated the walls. No mementos suggested connections to family or friends who might be following her progress through training. The space felt temporary, as if occupied by someone who had grown accustomed to leaving places and people behind without looking back. Her background file contained the standard information required for security clearance, but careful observers might have noticed gaps that didn't quite align with the timeline of someone who had supposedly spent her adult life in civilian pursuits. The inconsistencies were subtle enough to pass routine screening, yet significant enough to raise questions for anyone who looked closely at the details that didn't fit the simple narrative she presented. During the first week's physical assessments, Sarah's performance placed her solidly in the middle of the pack. Not outstanding enough to draw positive attention, not poor enough to warrant immediate dismissal, but adequate in ways that suggested careful calculation rather than natural limitation. Other candidates who struggled openly with the brutal physical demands somehow inspired more respect than someone who appeared to be managing the workload without visible strain. The psychological, Evaluation sessions revealed a mind that processed stress differently than most people attempting SEAL training. Where others showed normal signs of anxiety about the challenges ahead, Sarah displayed the kind of calm that psychologists associated with individuals who had already survived trauma that made current stressors feel manageable by comparison. Her responses to hypothetical scenarios demonstrated tactical thinking that seemed inconsistent with someone whose only military exposure came from basic research and preparation. Morrison began his campaign of focused harassment during the second week, assigning Sarah the most unpleasant tasks while making it clear that her presence was an unwelcome concession to political pressure rather than recognition of genuine qualification. His treatment remained technically within regulations while making it obvious that she faced a higher standard than anyone else in the training program. The other instructors followed Morrison's lead with varying degrees of enthusiasm, understanding that supporting his position was safer for their own careers than questioning the judgment of someone whose influence extended far beyond the training. Command. The institutional culture of the SEALs had always relied on conformity and loyalty to leadership, making it dangerous to appear sympathetic to someone who had been marked as unworthy of membership in their exclusive brotherhood. Sarah's response to the systematic harassment revealed character traits that made her tormentors increasingly uncomfortable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rather than breaking down under pressure or fighting back with emotional reactions that would justify her dismissal, she absorbed every insult and additional burden with quiet determination that seemed to grow stronger under stress. Her calm acceptance of unfair treatment began to highlight the pettiness of those who were supposed to represent the highest ideals of military leadership. Fellow candidates found themselves in an impossible position, caught between natural human sympathy for someone being treated unfairly and the practical necessity of avoiding association with someone who had clearly been designated as unacceptable by the command structure. The social dynamics of military training made individual conscience a luxury that few could afford when their own dreams of becoming SEALs hung in the balance. Tommy Rodriguez, a former Marine who had transferred to pursue SEAL training, watched Sarah's treatment with growing unease that he couldn't quite articulate to his teammates. His own background in combat zones had taught him to recognize genuine toughness, and something about Sarah's reactions to pressure reminded him of soldiers who had seen action rather than civilians attempting to prove themselves through training. Exercises. The drowning exercises that terrified most candidates seemed almost routine for Sarah, who demonstrated comfort in underwater environments that suggested extensive previous experience with situations where breathing was not guaranteed. Her movements in the water flowed with efficiency that spoke of muscle memory developed through repetition rather than recent instruction, though she was careful never to appear too comfortable with challenges that were designed to push candidates beyond their perceived limitations. During combat scenario training, Sarah's tactical instincts proved more refined than those of candidates who had spent years preparing specifically for SEAL selection. Her ability to assess threats and develop responses happened faster than the conscious thought processes that governed most people's decision-making under stress. The pattern recognition skills she displayed suggested experience with real-world applications rather than theoretical study of military doctrine. Morrison noticed these inconsistencies with growing suspicion that transformed his initial dismissive contempt into something approaching genuine concern about what he might be dealing with. Sarah's competence was becoming harder to dismiss as beginner's luck or natural aptitude, forcing him to consider possibilities that challenged his assumptions about who she really was and why she had appeared at his training facility. The medical examinations required for SEAL training revealed a body that bore subtle signs of previous trauma that didn't match the background of someone who had supposedly lived a civilian life, focused on academic and professional pursuits. Scar tissue patterns suggested encounters with violence that went beyond the normal accidents of athletic training, though the marks were old enough to avoid raising immediate red flags during routine processing. Sarah's pain tolerance during physical stress tests exceeded normal parameters in ways that suggested previous exposure to situations where enduring discomfort was necessary for survival rather than achievement. The medical staff noted her unusual responses in files that would eventually be reviewed by people whose security clearances allowed access to information that might explain the discrepancies between her supposed background and actual capabilities. Night training exercises revealed Sarah's supernatural awareness of her environment, an ability to function in darkness that went beyond what normal night vision training could explain. She seemed to navigate by instincts that had been developed through experience rather than instruction, moving through obstacle courses with confidence that suggested familiarity with operating in conditions where visibility was limited and danger was constant. The psychological pressure techniques used to break down candidates' resistance to stress seemed to have minimal impact on Sarah, who weathered verbal abuse and deliberately induced confusion with the detachment of someone who had survived worse treatment from people whose opinions mattered more than training instructors trying to simulate hostile interrogation. Her responses suggested someone who understood the difference between role-playing exercises and genuine threats to survival. Other candidates began noticing that Sarah's gear was always maintained to standards that exceeded what anyone else achieved, despite the additional duties Morrison assigned to limit her preparation time. Her equipment showed signs of care that came from understanding the life or death importance of reliable tools rather than simple attention to military regulations about appearance and functionality. The swimming portions of training that eliminated many otherwise qualified candidates seemed almost effortless for Sarah, who demonstrated comfort in ocean conditions that suggested extensive experience with environments where water could be either salvation or death, depending on skill and preparation. Her technique showed refinements that came from practical application rather than pool training, though she was careful never to appear too comfortable with challenges designed to test limits. During weapons training, Sarah's familiarity with firearms extended beyond what civilian shooting experience could explain, encompassing knowledge of maintenance, procedures, and tactical applications that typically required military or law enforcement background. Her muscle memory with weapon systems suggested hands-on experience with tools of violence in contexts where proficiency was measured by effectiveness rather than marksmanship scores. The isolation techniques used to break down candidates' mental resilience seemed to strengthen rather than weaken Sarah's determination, as if solitude provided relief from the constant effort of maintaining her carefully constructed identity. Other candidates who cracked under the pressure of deliberate social exclusion watched with amazement as she used isolation periods for reflection and preparation rather than despair and self-doubt. Morrison's frustration mounted as is usual. Methods for eliminating undesirable candidates proved ineffective against someone who seemed to grow stronger under pressure that broke others. Sarah's refusal to quit, despite treatment that had driven away candidates with superior physical qualifications, forced him to escalate his efforts in ways that began to attract attention from superiors who valued results over personal prejudices. The navigation exercises that challenged most candidates' ability to find their way through unfamiliar territory seemed routine for Sarah, who demonstrated land navigation skills that suggested experience with situations where getting lost meant more than failing a training exercise. Her ability to read terrain and weather patterns showed practical knowledge that came from necessity rather than academic study of military fieldcraft. Sleep deprivation techniques designed to test mental resilience under extreme fatigue seemed to affect Sarah less than other candidates, as if she had developed coping mechanisms through previous exposure to situations where rest was a luxury rather than a necessity. Her ability to function effectively despite deliberately induced exhaustion suggested reserves of mental and physical endurance that had been developed through experience rather than training. The team-building exercises that were supposed to create bonds between future SEALs revealed Sarah's natural leadership abilities, which emerged despite her deliberate efforts to avoid drawing attention to capabilities that might raise questions about her background. Other candidates instinctively looked to her for guidance during complex scenarios, recognizing competence that transcended rank or official position within the training hierarchy. Morrison's treatment of Sarah began affecting unit morale in ways he hadn't anticipated, as the best candidates started questioning leadership that seemed more concerned with personal prejudices than maintaining the standards that made SEL training legendary. The cognitive dissonance between stated values about merit-based selection and obvious bias against a candidate who was meeting all stated requirements created tension that undermined the institutional unity that was essential for effective training. Sarah's quarters were searched repeatedly by instructors, looking for evidence of violation that would justify her removal from training. But the inspections revealed nothing except possessions that matched her official background perfectly. The absence of any contraband or personal items that might reveal her true identity was itself suspicious to people trained to recognize when someone was hiding something significant. The underwater demolition training that gave SEAL preparation its original name seemed almost familiar to Sarah, who demonstrated comfort with explosives and underwater operations that suggested more than theoretical knowledge of combat diving techniques. Her understanding of timing, placement, and safety procedures reflected practical experience with situations where mistakes had consequences beyond failing grades or recycled training cycles. Emergency medical training revealed Sarah's familiarity with trauma treatment that went beyond standard first aid certification, encompassing knowledge of battlefield medicine that civilian backgrounds rarely provided. Her responses to simulated injuries showed competence that suggested previous exposure to situations where medical knowledge meant the difference between life and death for people who mattered personally rather than theoretically. The classified briefings that prepared candidates for the realities of special operations revealed Sarah's understanding of strategic thinking that seemed inconsistent with someone whose only exposure to military planning came through training materials and orientation sessions. Her questions demonstrated awareness of operational complexities that typically required experience with actual missions rather than academic study of special operations doctrine. Combat psychology sessions designed to prepare candidates for the mental challenges of warfare seemed unnecessary for Sarah, who already possessed the emotional regulation skills that others struggled to develop through training. Her responses to stress inoculation exercises suggested someone who had already learned to compartmentalize trauma and maintain functionality under conditions that overwhelmed normal psychological defenses. The survival training phases that tested candidates' ability to endure hardship while maintaining mission focus seemed routine for Sarah, who demonstrated skills that suggested previous exposure to situations where comfort was unavailable and survival required more than theoretical knowledge of fieldcraft. Her ability to find food, water, and shelter in challenging environments reflected practical experience rather than recently acquired training. Morrison's background investigations into Sarah's history encountered obstacles that frustrated his attempts to find disqualifying information, as if her civilian identity had been constructed by professionals who understood how to create backgrounds that would withstand scrutiny while concealing inconvenient truths. The absence of easily accessible information about her past became more suspicious than any specific revelation might have been. Fellow candidates who initially dismissed Sarah based on physical appearance began recognizing competence that transcended their preconceptions about what warriors looked like, though social pressure from the instruction staff made it dangerous to express respect for someone who had been designated as unworthy of membership in their elite community. The gap between her apparent qualifications and official treatment created cognitive dissonance that challenged everyone's understanding of fairness and merit. Sarah's performance during the infamous Hell Week approached with anticipation from instructors who expected the brutal physical and mental challenges to eliminate someone they viewed as a diversity experiment rather than a genuine candidate for the world's most elite military unit. The week-long ordeal of continuous training with minimal sleep and maximum stress had broken candidates who appeared far more physically imposing than someone whose presence represented everything they believed was wrong with modern military standards. The logs boat exercises that required teams to carry heavy rubber boats over obstacles while instructors provided negative motivation seemed almost manageable for Sarah, who demonstrated stamina that suggested previous experience with situations where physical endurance was necessary for survival rather than achievement. Her ability to maintain performance under sustained physical stress impressed teammates who had initially doubted her capability to contribute meaningfully to team efforts. Rock portage training that challenged candidates' ability to navigate dangerous surf conditions while carrying equipment revealed Sarah's comfort with ocean environments that went beyond what civilian water sports could explain. Her understanding of wave patterns, current dynamics, and safety procedures reflected practical knowledge that came from necessity rather than recreational experience with marine environments. The telephone pole exercises that required teams to lift and maneuver heavy obstacles while exhausted and stressed seemed routine for Sarah, who demonstrated understanding of leverage, teamwork, and problem-solving that suggested experience with situations where failure to complete physical challenges had consequences beyond disappointing instructors. Her natural leadership during these exercises emerged despite efforts to avoid drawing attention to capabilities that might raise uncomfortable questions. As Hell Week progressed, Sarah's performance began attracting attention from senior instructors who had expected her elimination during the first day of intensive training. Her ability to maintain effectiveness despite sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and deliberate psychological pressure suggested reserves of mental and physical endurance that contradicted everything they thought they knew about her background and qualifications. The night training exercises that pushed candidates beyond normal limits of human endurance seemed familiar to Sarah, who navigated challenges with confidence that suggested previous exposure to situations where darkness provided concealment rather than confusion. Her ability to function effectively when others struggled with disorientation and fatigue demonstrated skills that transcended what recent training could provide. Tommy Rodriguez found himself assigned to Sarah's boat crew during particularly challenging evolutions, giving him opportunities to observe her performance under conditions that revealed character rather than simply testing physical capability. What he witnessed challenged his preconceptions about strength, endurance, and what qualified someone for membership in the warrior community he had dreamed of joining since childhood. The log exercises that required sustained teamwork while carrying impossibly heavy obstacles revealed Sarah's understanding of group dynamics and leadership that seemed inconsistent with someone whose background suggested limited experience with high-stress team environments. Her ability to motivate exhausted teammates and coordinate efforts during chaotic conditions demonstrated competence that earned respect, despite official disapproval from the instruction staff. Morrison watched Sarah's performance during Hell Week with growing unease, as his predictions about her inevitable failure were contradicted by evidence of capability that exceeded many male candidates who appeared more physically imposing. Her refusal to quit despite treatment designed to eliminate her forced him to confront the possibility that his assumptions about gender and military effectiveness might require reconsideration. The beach running that formed a central component of SEAL training seemed effortless for Sarah, who maintained pace with candidates who had spent years preparing specifically for the physical demands of selection. Her running form suggested muscle memory developed through necessity rather than training, as if covering long distances quickly had been a survival skill rather than an athletic pursuit. Cold water exposure that eliminated candidates who couldn't tolerate the physical stress of hypothermia seemed manageable for Sarah, who demonstrated understanding of thermal regulation and mental control that suggested previous experience with situations where environmental challenges were life-threatening rather than simply uncomfortable. Her ability to function effectively despite physical discomfort that overwhelmed others indicated reserves of mental toughness that couldn't be taught through classroom instruction. Equipment maintenance standards that required perfect attention to detail despite exhaustion and time pressure seemed routine for Sarah, whose gear always met inspection requirements regardless of how little time she was given for preparation. Her understanding of the life or death importance of reliable equipment suggested experience with situations where mechanical failure had consequences beyond receiving negative feedback from instructors. The obstacle course evolutions that tested agility, strength, and problem-solving under stress seemed familiar to Sarah, who navigated complex challenges with efficiency that suggested previous experience with environments where physical obstacles represented real barriers to mission success rather than training exercises. Her technique showed refinements that came from practical application rather than repetitive practice in controlled environments. Medical training scenarios that required candidates to treat simulated injuries while under stress revealed Sarah's comfort with trauma situations that went beyond standard first aid certification. Her responses to emergency medical challenges suggested familiarity with real casualties rather than training mannequins, encompassing knowledge of battlefield medicine that civilian backgrounds rarely provided through normal life experiences. The weapons training that formed an essential component of SEAL preparation revealed Sarah's familiarity with combat systems that extended beyond what shooting sports could explain, encompassing maintenance procedures and tactical applications that typically required military or law enforcement background. Her muscle memory with weapon systems suggested hands-on experience with tools of violence in contexts where proficiency was measured by survival rather than marksmanship scores. Sarah's psychological evaluations during Hell Week showed responses that puzzled the mental health professionals who monitored candidate welfare throughout the brutal training process. Instead of the normal signs of stress and fatigue that characterized even successful candidates, she displayed the kind of calm that was associated with individuals who had already survived trauma that made current challenges feel manageable. By comparison, the demolition training that prepared candidates for combat engineering missions seemed almost routine for Sarah, who demonstrated understanding of explosives and underwater operations that suggested more than theoretical knowledge of combat diving techniques. Her grasp of timing, placement, and safety procedures reflected practical experience with situations where mistakes had consequences beyond failing grades or requiring additional training cycles. Communication exercises that tested candidates' ability to relay information accurately under stress revealed Sarah's understanding of military protocols that went beyond what orientation materials covered, encompassing knowledge of operational procedures that typically required experience with actual missions rather than academic study of special operations doctrine. Her familiarity with classified communication systems raised questions about how someone with her supposed background had acquired such specific knowledge. Tommy Rodriguez began questioning his own assumptions about military effectiveness as he watched Sarah's performance throughout Hell Week, recognizing competence that transcended physical appearance and challenged stereotypes about what warriors looked like. Her ability to inspire confidence in teammates and contribute meaningfully to collective efforts earned respect that contradicted the official narrative about her unsuitability for SEAL training. The final days of Hell Week approached with anticipation, from instructors who expected exhaustion and stress to reveal Sarah's true limitations, proving that her earlier performance had been sustained through luck rather than genuine capability. The accumulated fatigue and physical damage that broke even exceptional candidates were expected to eliminate someone whose presence represented compromise with standards that had maintained SEAL effectiveness for decades. But as Sarah prepared for the final challenges that would determine her fate, something in her demeanor suggested that Hell Week was about to become far more interesting than anyone had anticipated. The woman who had absorbed weeks of systematic harassment while demonstrating unexpected competence was approaching the moment when her true identity would be impossible to conceal any longer. The final phase of Hell Week began at 0400 hours on a Thursday morning that would become legendary in SEAL training history. Sarah stood with the remaining candidates in the pre-dawn darkness, her uniform soaked with Pacific Ocean salt water and sand that had become a second skin over the past 4 days of relentless training. The exhaustion that had eliminated 60% of the original class seemed to have no effect on her steady breathing or alert posture, though dark circles under her eyes betrayed the toll of operating on less than 4 hours of sleep across nearly a week of continuous operations. Commander Morrison observed the survivors with satisfaction mixed with growing unease about one particular candidate who refused to conform to his expectations about female limitations under extreme stress. Sarah's presence among the final group represented a failure of his carefully orchestrated campaign to demonstrate that political correctness had no place in warrior selection. Every hour she remained standing challenged his fundamental beliefs about gender roles and military effectiveness in ways that made him increasingly desperate to find her breaking point. The obstacle course that awaited them had been modified specifically for Hell Week's conclusion, incorporating elements designed to test every skill developed throughout SEAL training while pushing candidates beyond their perceived physical and mental limitations. Rope climbs extended 50 feet into the morning fog, requiring upper body strength that many male candidates found challenging after days of accumulated fatigue. Log carries demanded teamwork coordination when individual thinking had been compromised by sleep deprivation and stress hormones that clouded judgment and slowed reaction times. Sarah approached the first obstacle with movements that flowed like water on stone, her technique demonstrating efficiency that suggested muscle memory developed through repetition in environments where failure carried consequences beyond disappointing instructors. The rope climb that challenged exhausted candidates became a fluid ascent that revealed core strength and coordination that seemed inconsistent with someone whose background suggested academic rather than physical pursuits throughout her adult development. Tommy Rodriguez watched from his position in the obstacle course, his Marine training providing perspective that allowed him to recognize genuine competence when he witnessed it firsthand. Sarah's performance during the rope traverse showed understanding of weight distribution and momentum that came from practical application rather than gymnasium instruction, her movements economical in ways that conserved energy, while maintaining speed that kept pace with candidates who possessed obvious physical advantages. The underwater demolition exercise that followed pushed candidates into environments where panic could prove fatal and precise thinking became essential for survival. Teams were required to place simulated charges on submerged obstacles while managing limited air supplies and maintaining communication through hand signals that had to be executed perfectly, despite fatigue that compromised fine motor control and cognitive processing under stress. Sarah's comfort in the underwater environment became impossible to conceal as she demonstrated diving techniques that went far beyond what civilian certification programs typically provided. Her ability to remain calm while managing complex tasks in an environment that terrified many experienced swimmers suggested familiarity with situations where underwater operations were conducted for purposes more serious than training exercises designed to test candidate resilience. The medical scenario that comprised the next evolution challenged candidates to treat simulated casualties while under simulated enemy fire, requiring technical knowledge combined with decision-making under pressure that separated future SEALs. from individuals who might possess individual skills, but lacked the mental frameworks necessary for combat effectiveness. Realistic injuries created using Hollywood special effects demanded responses that went beyond basic first aid into battlefield medicine that could mean the difference between saving lives and watching teammates die from treatable injuries. Sarah's response to the medical emergency revealed knowledge that made the observing corpsmen exchange glances of recognition and concern. Her assessment of simulated injuries followed protocols that weren't taught in civilian emergency response. Courses encompassing triage decisions and treatment procedures that suggested exposure to real trauma situations where medical knowledge had been applied under conditions that made training scenarios seem comfortable by comparison. Commander Morrison positioned himself where he could observe Sarah's performance during the medical evolution, his suspicions about her background growing stronger with each demonstration of competence that exceeded what her official file suggested should be possible. The gap between her supposed civilian experience and actual capabilities was becoming too obvious to ignore, forcing him to consider possibilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about her identity and qualifications. The navigation exercise that followed required candidates to move through unfamiliar terrain using only compass headings and natural landmarks, while carrying full combat loads that made every step a conscious effort against gravity and accumulated fatigue. The course had been designed to simulate movement through hostile territory, where getting lost could result in capture or death, making accuracy essential, while physical exhaustion made concentration increasingly difficult to maintain. Sarah's land navigation skills proved exceptional in ways that suggested experience with situations where finding designated coordinates was more than an academic exercise in map reading and compass manipulation. Her ability to maintain direction despite challenging terrain and limited visibility demonstrated practical knowledge that came from necessity rather than theoretical study of orienteering techniques taught in outdoor recreation programs. The team coordination exercise that marked Hell Week's midpoint challenged surviving candidates to work together on complex problems, while individual judgment was compromised by stress and exhaustion that made communication difficult and cooperation potentially dangerous. Teams were required to move heavy equipment across obstacles that demanded precise timing and absolute trust between individuals who had been deliberately weakened through days of systematic physical and mental pressure. During this evolution, Sarah's natural leadership abilities emerged, despite her deliberate efforts to avoid drawing attention to capabilities that might raise uncomfortable questions about her background and training. Other candidates instinctively looked to her for guidance when official leadership structures broke down under stress, recognizing competence that transcended rank or position within the artificial hierarchy of training programs designed to simulate combat conditions. The weapons handling exercise that followed tested familiarity with combat systems under conditions that made safety protocols essential, while fatigue made concentration increasingly difficult to maintain. Candidates were required to demonstrate proficiency with multiple weapon platforms, while executing tactical movements that simulated real-world applications where mistakes could prove fatal to the operator or nearby friendly forces. Sarah's performance with weapon systems revealed muscle memory that suggested extensive previous experience with tools of violence in contexts where proficiency was measured by effectiveness rather than range scores or instructor evaluations. Her understanding of weapon maintenance, ammunition management, and tactical employment demonstrated knowledge that typically required military or law enforcement background, rather than civilian shooting sports participation. The psychological evaluation that occurred during Hell Week's second half challenged candidates to maintain mental stability, while instructors used approved techniques to simulate the stress of hostile interrogation and social isolation that might be encountered during actual operations behind enemy lines. The evolution was designed to identify individuals who might compromise sensitive information under pressure, while revealing character traits that predicted performance in high-stress operational environments. Sarah's responses to psychological pressure revealed mental frameworks that had been developed through exposure to real rather than simulated stress. Her ability to compartmentalize discomfort and maintain focus suggesting previous experience with situations where mental resilience was necessary for survival rather than simply advancement through training programs. Her performance during mock interrogation scenarios demonstrated understanding of resistance techniques that weren't taught in civilian preparatory courses. The cold water evolution that had eliminated numerous candidates throughout Hell Weeks. History pushed survivors into hypothermic conditions that tested physiological limits while demanding continued performance of complex tasks that required fine motor control and clear thinking despite physical systems that were shutting down to preserve core body temperature and essential organ function. Sarah's tolerance for cold water exposure exceeded normal parameters in ways that suggested adaptation through previous experience rather than natural physiological advantages. Her ability to function effectively while others struggled with hypothermia-induced confusion and motor skill degradation demonstrated reserves of mental and physical toughness that had been developed through necessity rather than training designed to simulate extreme conditions. The beach running that continued throughout Hell Week reached its culmination during the final days when accumulated fatigue made each step a conscious victory over physical systems that demanded rest and recovery. The soft sand that provided unstable footing combined with equipment loads that made every movement an effort against gravity and momentum that threatened to stop forward progress completely. Sarah maintained pace with candidates who appeared more physically imposing while demonstrating running efficiency that suggested technique developed through situations where covering distance quickly was essential for survival rather than simply meeting training standards. Her ability to encourage exhausted teammates while maintaining her own performance revealed leadership qualities that emerged naturally under stress rather than being performed for instructor evaluation. The demolition exercise that marked Hell Week's technical pinnacle required candidates to plan and execute underwater explosive operations while managing limited air supplies and maintaining safety protocols that became increasingly difficult to remember as fatigue compromised cognitive function and decision-making abilities. The evolution simulated real-world combat diving missions where mistakes could prove fatal to the operator and compromise mission success. Sarah's comfort with underwater demolition work became impossible to disguise as she demonstrated familiarity with explosive placement techniques and safety procedures that went beyond what civilian diving certification typically provided. Her understanding of timing, detonation sequences, and underwater physics suggested practical experience with combat engineering rather than theoretical knowledge gained through classroom instruction. The final communication exercise challenged candidates to relay complex information accurately while under stress that made concentration difficult and memory unreliable due to accumulated fatigue and hormone cascades that affected cognitive processing. The evolution simulated battlefield conditions where communication failures could result in friendly fire incidents or mission compromise that might affect strategic objectives beyond immediate tactical situations. Sarah's performance during communication challenges revealed understanding of military protocols and classified procedures that raised questions about how someone with her supposed background had acquired knowledge that typically required security clearances and operational experience. Her familiarity with communication systems and encryption methods suggested exposure to actual rather than simulated military operations. Commander Morrison's investigation into Sarah's background intensified as her performance throughout Hell Week contradicted every assumption he had made about her qualifications and suitability for SEAL training. The obstacles he encountered while researching her civilian identity suggested professional construction of her background that went beyond what normal privacy concerns would require. implying connections to organizations that possessed resources and motivation to create false identities. The database searches that should have revealed detailed information about Sarah's educational background, employment history, and personal connections instead encountered access restrictions that required security clearances above Morrison's authorization level. The patterns of missing information suggested deliberate concealment rather than normal gaps in digital records, implying that her true identity was protected by agencies with authority that exceeded standard military channels. Tommy Rodriguez found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about strength, endurance, and military effectiveness as he observed Sarah's performance throughout Hell Week's most challenging evolutions. Her ability to maintain functionality while others struggled with exhaustion and stress demonstrated qualities that transcended physical appearance and challenged stereotypes about what warriors looked like when stripped of uniform insignia and reduced to basic human capability. The survival exercise that concluded Hell Week's technical training pushed candidates into environments where comfort was unavailable in mission. Success required more than theoretical knowledge of fieldcraft and resource management. Teams were inserted into hostile terrain with minimal equipment and challenged to reach extraction points while avoiding simulated enemy forces that would treat capture as mission failure, requiring recycling through training programs. Sarah's survival skills proved exceptional in ways that suggested experience with situations where finding food, water, and shelter was essential for staying alive rather than simply completing training requirements. Her knowledge of edible plants, water purification techniques, and camouflage methods reflected practical application rather than recently acquired information from survival handbooks and field manuals. The final team exercise that marked Hell Week's official conclusion required all surviving candidates to work together on a complex mission simulation that incorporated every skill developed throughout the training cycle while pushing them beyond normal limits of human endurance and stress tolerance. Success demanded coordination between individuals who had been systematically weakened through days of accumulated fatigue and psychological pressure. During this ultimate challenge, Sarah's true capabilities became impossible to conceal any longer as she demonstrated tactical thinking and operational planning that went far beyond what civilian backgrounds could provide. Her understanding of mission analysis, risk assessment, and contingency planning revealed experience with real-world applications where failure carried consequences beyond disappointing instructors or requiring additional training cycles. The debriefing session that followed Hell Week's completion brought together candidates who had survived the ultimate test of SEAL training while revealing individual performances that would determine advancement to the next phase of preparation for operational deployment. Sarah's scores across all measured categories placed her among the top performers, despite weeks of systematic harassment designed to eliminate her from consideration. Commander Morrison found himself confronting evidence that contradicted every assumption he had made about gender limitations and military effectiveness. His carefully constructed beliefs about warrior culture, challenged by undeniable proof that his prejudices had blinded him to genuine capability. The woman he had dismissed as a diversity experiment had outperformed male candidates who appeared more physically imposing while demonstrating skills that suggested background he couldn't access through normal channels. The medical evaluation that followed Hell Week revealed Sarah's physiological responses to extreme stress that puzzled medical personnel who monitored candidate health throughout the brutal training process. Instead of the normal indicators of accumulated damage and exhaustion that characterized even successful candidates, she displayed recovery patterns that suggested adaptation through previous exposure to similar stress rather than first-time experience with extreme physical demands. Senior instructors who had expected Sarah's elimination during Hell Week's early phases found themselves reviewing performance records that documented exceptional capability across every measured category of SEAL training requirements. Her scores in technical skills, physical performance, leadership potential, and psychological resilience placed her among the most qualified candidates they had evaluated in recent training cycles. The classified briefing that prepared Hell Week survivors for advanced phases of SEAL training revealed Sarah's understanding of strategic concepts and operational planning that seemed inconsistent with someone whose only exposure to military thinking came through preparatory research and orientation materials. Her questions demonstrated familiarity with classified doctrine and tactical principles that typically required experience with actual operations rather than academic study. Intelligence personnel who monitored candidate backgrounds during SEAL training began investigating discrepancies between Sarah's official identity and demonstrated capabilities that suggested connections to classified programs or operations that might explain her exceptional qualifications. The security review that followed raised questions about whether her presence at SEAL training represented standard candidate processing or something more complex that required higher-level authorization. The psychological assessment that concluded Hell Week evaluation documented Sarah's mental resilience and stress tolerance that exceeded normal parameters for civilian candidates attempting military training. Her responses to extreme pressure suggested previous adaptation to trauma that made current challenges manageable rather than overwhelming, implying experience with situations that civilian backgrounds rarely provided. As Hell Week officially ended and surviving candidates prepared for advanced training phases, Sarah's performance had created ripple effects throughout the SEAL training command that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and military effectiveness. Her presence among the top performers forced reconsideration of policies and attitudes that had shaped warrior culture for generations while raising questions about her true identity that would soon demand answers. The woman who had endured weeks of systematic harassment while demonstrating exceptional capability was approaching the moment when her carefully maintained civilian identity would be impossible to sustain any longer. Hell Week had revealed skills and knowledge that civilian backgrounds could not explain, setting the stage for revelations that would transform everyone's understanding of who Sarah Chun really was, and why she had appeared at SEAL training when her qualifications suggested she belonged somewhere far more classified and dangerous. The graduation ceremony for Hell Week survivors was scheduled for Friday morning in the main amphitheater at Coronado Naval Base, where families and distinguished guests would witness the formal recognition of candidates who had endured the most grueling military training program in existence. Sarah stood with the other survivors in formation, her dress uniform crisp, despite the accumulated wear of months spent proving herself worthy of advancement to the next phase of SEAL preparation. Admiral Patricia Hayes surveyed the assembled candidates from her position on the reviewing stand, her weathered face bearing the marks of 3 decades spent making decisions that affected national security at the highest levels. As Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare, she possessed security clearances that provided access to information most military personnel would never see, including classified personnel files that contained truths too sensitive for standard military records. Commander Morrison positioned himself at the podium with obvious satisfaction, preparing to address an audience that included senior Navy leadership and family members who had traveled across the country to witness their loved one's achievement. The ceremony would demonstrate his authority while celebrating the elimination of candidates who had proven unworthy of membership in the world's most elite military unit. The morning breeze carried salt air across the base as Morrison began. His remarks about tradition, excellence, and the standards that separated SEALs from ordinary military personnel. His words emphasized the importance of maintaining criteria that had produced generations of warriors capable of operating in environments where failure meant death and success required abilities that transcended normal human limitations. Sarah listened to the familiar rhetoric about sacrifice and dedication while remembering ceremonies that honored fallen comrades whose names would never appear on public monuments or receive recognition from people who benefited from their ultimate sacrifice. The disconnect between official celebrations and actual costs of military service had become a recurring theme throughout her adult life, creating cynicism about rituals designed more for public consumption than genuine commemoration. When Morrison called surviving candidates forward to receive their certificates of Hell Week completion, Sarah moved with military precision that immediately caught Admiral Hayes' attention. Her bearing demonstrated training that went beyond what SEAL preparation typically provided, suggesting background in military disciplines that weren't part of standard Navy programs or civilian preparation courses. Admiral Hayes studied Sarah's face with growing recognition that triggered memories from classified briefings she had attended years earlier when serving as Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence. The facial features seemed familiar in ways that made her stomach tighten with unease about implications that could affect ongoing operations and personnel, whose safety depended on maintaining carefully constructed identities. As certificates were distributed and families applauded their loved ones' achievements, Admiral Hayes accessed secure communication systems that allowed her to conduct real-time database searches using facial recognition software connected to classified personnel files. The results that appeared on her encrypted device made her blood run cold as she realized the true identity of the woman standing information below. The database match was exact down to a small scar above Sarah's left eyebrow that appeared in photographs taken during classified operations conducted in hostile territory where American personnel operated under deep cover identities that protected ongoing missions from enemy intelligence services. According to official records, Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez had been killed in action 80 months earlier during a classified operation that had gone wrong due to political interference and intelligence failures. Admiral Hayes remembered the after-action reports that had detailed how Vasquez's entire team had been compromised by leaked information that allowed enemy forces to identify and target American operatives who were conducting sensitive missions in regions where their presence could not be officially acknowledged. The political fallout from the operation's failure had required careful management to prevent international incidents that might destabilize strategic relationships. The medals that had been offered posthumously to honor Vasquez's sacrifice had been declined by family members who understood that recognition built on classified operations served political purposes rather than genuine commemoration of service that could never be publicly acknowledged. Her death had been officially recorded to protect ongoing operations, while allowing her to disappear from official existence if she had somehow survived the mission that had claimed her teammates. As the ceremony continued and Morrison praised the achievements of Hell Week survivors, Admiral Hayes grappled with implications of Elena Vasquez's presence at SEAL, training under an assumed identity that had somehow passed security screening, designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Her survival raised questions about what had really happened during that classified operation, and why she had chosen to emerge from whatever shadows had protected her. The final phase of the ceremony required candidates to recite the SEAL Creed that embodied the values and commitments expected from members of the elite unit. Sarah's voice joined the chorus, reciting words about honor, courage, and dedication to mission success regardless of personal cost, though her expression suggested complex emotions about oaths that had been broken by people whose decisions had cost lives unnecessarily. When the ceremony concluded and families began congratulating their loved ones, Admiral Hayes made her way through the crowd toward Sarah with deliberate movements that drew attention from nearby personnel. Her approach created a zone of silence as people recognized the significance of a flag officer seeking direct conversation with a junior candidate who had no apparent reason to warrant such attention. Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, Admiral Hayes said quietly, using the name that officially belonged to someone who had been declared killed in action. during a classified operation that most people present would never be allowed to know existed. The words sent electric shock through nearby witnesses who suddenly understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in military protocol and chain of command. Sarah's carefully maintained civilian identity shattered in an instant as recognition dawned on faces throughout the crowd. The transformation was immediate and complete as she abandoned the careful anonymity that had protected her true identity throughout months of systematic harassment and deliberate underestimation by people who lacked the security clearances necessary to understand who they had been dealing with. Commander Morrison stared in growing horror as he began to comprehend that his campaign of harassment had been directed against someone whose actual qualifications far exceeded his own achievements and whose service record included operations. That made his peacetime leadership experience appear trivial by comparison. The systematic persecution of a genuine war hero represented the kind of error that could destroy careers and reputations permanently. "Ma'am," Sarah replied simply, her voice carrying new undertones of authority that made everyone present reevaluate their assumptions about military hierarchy and the relationship between rank and actual capability. The woman who had endured months of discrimination was revealed as someone whose credentials included experiences that most SEALs would never approach in complexity or danger. Admiral Hayes nodded slowly, understanding immediately the courage required for Elena to maintain her cover while enduring treatment that would have broken lesser individuals. "Your team's sacrifice in Operation Deep Strike prevented what intelligence analysts believed could have escalated into regional conflict involving multiple nuclear powers. The political interference that compromised your mission was inexcusable. But your survival represents an opportunity that the Navy cannot afford to waste." The crowd remained frozen in stunned silence as they processed information that challenged everything they thought they knew about military service, sacrifice, and the difference between official recognition and actual contribution to national security. The woman who had been dismissed as a diversity experiment was revealed as a decorated special operations officer whose supposed death had been fabricated to protect ongoing classified programs. Elena's expression remained composed despite the emotional weight of memories that 18 months of anonymity had not diminished. "My team died because someone in Washington decided that diplomatic considerations were more important than extraction planning. Because operational security was compromised by people who valued political convenience over human lives." The medals offered afterward represented blood money designed to silence uncomfortable questions rather than honor genuine sacrifice. The transformation of the ceremony from routine military celebration to moment of uncomfortable truth was immediate and complete. Military personnel throughout the amphitheater began coming to attention without being ordered, showing respect that should have been automatic if anyone had understood the true identity of the woman who had been walking among them while enduring systematic discrimination. Tommy Rodriguez felt his worldview shift fundamentally as he realized the woman he had watched survive impossible challenges possessed qualifications that made every assumption about strength, courage, and military effectiveness seem naive and uninformed. The respect he had developed for Sarah's performance during training was revealed as inadequate recognition of someone whose service record included achievements that most warriors could never hope to approach. Commander Morrison's career effectively ended in that moment as senior officers throughout the audience understood that his treatment of a genuine war hero represented failure of judgment that made him unsuitable for positions requiring leadership or discretion. The systematic harassment of someone whose credentials included classified operations that protected American interests had exposed character flaws that could not be overlooked or excused. Admiral Hayes stepped forward to address the assembled crowd, her voice carrying authority that came from decades of making decisions that affected national security at strategic levels. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez volunteered for Operation Deep Strike, knowing that success might require the ultimate sacrifice. When political interference compromised her team's safety, she chose to honor her fallen comrades by disappearing rather than accepting recognition built on their deaths. The classified nature of Elena's actual service record meant that most details could never be publicly acknowledged, but Admiral Hayes provided enough information to help the audience understand the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The woman, who had endured months of discrimination, possessed qualifications that included successful completion of training programs that made SEAL preparation seem introductory by comparison. Elena's presence at Coronado represented more than personal choice to test herself against SEAL standards. Her knowledge and experience could prevent future tragedies like the one that had claimed her teammates, if the institution was wise enough to learn from someone who had paid the ultimate price for political interference in operational decisions that should have been made by people with actual military experience. The offer that followed was unprecedented in SEAL history, reflecting recognition that Elena's qualifications exceeded what normal career progression could provide. Admiral Hayes proposed that she accept assignment as Chief Instructor for Advanced Combat Operations, a position that would allow her to share knowledge gained through classified missions, while helping prepare the next generation of special operations personnel for realities that traditional training often ignored. Elena considered the proposal carefully, understanding that acceptance would mean permanently abandoning the anonymity that had protected her while potentially making a difference in preventing others from experiencing similar betrayal by political leaders who treated military personnel as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving support and loyalty. The conditions offered reflected exactly what Elena valued most: substance over ceremony, reality over propaganda, integrity over recognition. Her teaching would include everything that traditional military education avoided, including political interference that cost lives, intelligence failures that compromised missions, and the difference between serving national interests and serving the careers of people who never faced consequences for being wrong. "I accept the assignment," Elena said quietly, her words carrying implications that would transform SEAL training and potentially influence special operations doctrine throughout the military establishment. "But my instruction will include honest assessment of political realities and command failures that contribute to operational casualties. Students will learn about the costs of bureaucratic cowardice and the importance of protecting subordinates from leaders who value personal advancement over mission success." The aftermath of Elena's revelation spread through the SEAL community like wildfire, challenging fundamental assumptions about gender roles, political interference, and the relationship between official recognition and actual contribution to national security. Her story became legendary within classified circles, passed down through informal networks of operators who understood the difference between public ceremonies and private sacrifice. Commander Morrison's reassignment to administrative duties represented institutional recognition that his judgment could not be trusted with important responsibilities, making him a cautionary example for leaders who allowed personal prejudices to override professional evaluation of subordinate capabilities. The system began changing through accumulated individual decisions to value substance over appearance and merit over comfortable assumptions about who deserved respect and recognition. Elena's influence on SEAL training grew through demonstrated effectiveness rather than celebrity, her methods becoming standard practice because they produced operators who were better prepared for real-world challenges that combined technical competence with ethical grounding and political awareness. Her approach to military education was adopted throughout special operations commands as leaders recognized practical benefits of honest instruction over sanitized propaganda. The woman who had refused to quit despite systematic harassment had created transformation that honored her fallen teammates more effectively than any ceremony could accomplish. proving that individual integrity could indeed change institutions when courage met opportunity at exactly the right moment. Elena Vasquez had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest act of service was surviving when others expected you to fail, then using that survival to prevent future tragedies, through truth that challenged comfortable lies about military effectiveness and political accountability. 5 years after the graduation ceremony that changed everything at Coronado Naval Base, Elena Vasquez had transformed SEAL training in ways that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single military installation. Her influence spread through the special operations community like ripples across still water, creating changes that honored her fallen teammates, while preparing future operators for realities that sanitized military education typically avoided. The classroom where Elena conducted her advanced tactical instruction had become something of a pilgrimage site for special operations personnel who understood they were witnessing something rare and valuable in military education. Unlike traditional instructors who focused on procedures and protocols, Elena taught the kind of wisdom that could only come from someone who had experienced the worst consequences of political interference and bureaucratic failure in operational environments. Her curriculum included no glorification of warfare or stirring speeches about glory that ignored the human cost of decisions made by people who never faced consequences for being wrong. Instead, students encountered realistic scenarios where every choice carried moral weight and where the right decision might be the one that destroyed careers while saving lives and protecting national interests from political expedience. Captain Maria Santos, one of Elena's first students who now served as an instructor herself at the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, explained the transformation to visiting Pentagon officials who were studying the Coronado model for potential implementation throughout Special Operations Commands. Commander Vasquez changed how we think about everything from mission planning to command responsibility. She taught us that genuine leadership requires the courage to question orders that serve political purposes rather than operational necessity. The simple memorial Elena maintained for her fallen teammates from Operation Deep Strike had become a place where students and colleagues came to understand that honor required remembering those whose sacrifice received no public recognition. The private ceremony she conducted annually attracted flowers from people who had never known her comrades but understood their significance as symbols of service that put principle before political convenience. Elena's approach to military education had been adopted by training facilities across the special operations community as commanders recognized the practical benefits of honest instruction over propaganda designed to make politicians comfortable with decisions that cost lives in distant places. Her methods produced operators who combined technical competence with ethical grounding and political awareness that made them more effective in complex operational environments. Real transformation happened through accumulated individual decisions. Rather than dramatic policy announcements, daily choices to value substance over appearance and truth over convenient fiction. Students who graduated from Elena's programs advanced to positions of authority throughout the military establishment, carrying forward lessons about integrity and courage that gradually reshaped institutional culture from the ground up. The influence extended beyond direct instruction as Elena's students became leaders who understood the difference between serving national interests and serving the careers of people who treated military personnel as expendable resources. They implemented changes in their own commands that protected subordinates from political interference, while maintaining operational effectiveness that proved superior to traditional approaches based on blind obedience to authority. Tommy Rodriguez, now a senior enlisted advisor at Naval Special Warfare Command, often reflected on how witnessing Elena's journey had fundamentally changed his understanding of strength, courage, and what qualified someone for membership in the warrior community. The woman who had endured systematic discrimination while demonstrating exceptional capability had proven that character mattered more than physical appearance or conformity to stereotypes about military effectiveness. The cultural transformation at Coronado spread gradually through daily interactions and changed expectations rather than sensitivity, training sessions or policy mandates from senior leadership. Base culture shifted from hierarchy worship to merit-based respect as people began understanding that rank meant nothing without wisdom and that authority without character became tyranny disguised as tradition. Elena's story had gradually become legend within special operations circles, passed down through informal networks of operators who understood the difference between official histories and actual events that shaped their institution. The legend focused not on her classified accomplishments, but on her choice to serve truth rather than recognition, to teach substance rather than propaganda, to honor fallen comrades through integrity rather than ceremony. Media organizations had long since stopped attempting to interview the mysterious instructor, whose story occasionally surfaced in military publications and intelligence community discussions. Elena's only public statement remained characteristically direct and uncompromising about the relationship between genuine service and performance of patriotism for public consumption. Her refusal of celebrity demonstrated the same principles that had guided her rejection of medals, built on the deaths of her teammates, choosing integrity over recognition and substance over appearance in ways that challenged conventional understanding of what motivated people to serve in dangerous occupations that offered little public acknowledgement or financial reward. The Pentagon study group that examined Elena's methods concluded that her approach to military education represented a fundamental improvement over traditional instruction that emphasized compliance over critical thinking. Their classified report recommended implementation of similar programs throughout special operations commands, recognizing that future conflicts would require leaders who could navigate political complexities while maintaining operational effectiveness. Senior military officials who had initially resisted Elena's unconventional methods were forced to acknowledge superior results produced by operators trained under her guidance. Mission success rates improved while casualty figures decreased, as students learned to recognize and avoid political traps that had historically compromised operational security and endangered American personnel in hostile environments. The transformation extended to recruitment and selection processes as Elena's influence challenged assumptions about who possessed the qualities necessary for special operations success. Physical standards remained unchanged, but evaluation criteria expanded to include character traits and critical thinking abilities that proved more predictive of operational effectiveness than traditional measures of aggression and conformity. Women who entered SEAL training after Elena's revelation found an environment that evaluated capability rather than gender, though the physical and mental demands remained as challenging as ever. The difference was that discrimination based on prejudice rather than performance had been largely eliminated through cultural changes that valued substance over stereotypes about warrior identity. Elena's private quarters reflected the same understated efficiency that had characterized her civilian cover identity, though now decorated with mementos from grateful students and colleagues who understood the significance of her contribution to military effectiveness and institutional integrity. The space felt lived in rather than temporary, suggesting someone who had finally found a place where her skills and experience could make a meaningful difference. The intelligence community had quietly acknowledged Elena's survival and new identity, updating classified records to reflect her transition from operational status to training command, without compromising ongoing programs that depended on maintaining cover identities for personnel who might need to disappear from official existence in the future. Commander Morrison's journey toward understanding had proven slow and painful, requiring the dismantling of beliefs and attitudes that had shaped his identity for decades while building new perspectives based on humility rather than assumed superiority. His current position in logistics management suited his administrative skills while keeping him away from leadership roles that required wisdom he was still developing. During a private conversation with Admiral Hayes, Morrison admitted the scope of his transformation and the lessons learned through his encounter with Elena's true identity. "I was wrong about everything, not just about Commander Vasquez, but about what makes someone worthy of respect and recognition. I spent decades in uniform thinking rank and tradition were enough, never understanding that character matters more than authority or appearances." Admiral Hayes observed the broader transformation with satisfaction, recognizing that Elena's influence had created new standards for what military education should accomplish throughout the special operations community. Students graduated understanding that their oath was to the Constitution and the American people, not to political careers or bureaucratic convenience that might compromise mission effectiveness. The classified briefings that Elena conducted for senior military leadership provided insights into political interference and intelligence failures that had historically compromised operations and endangered American personnel. Her analysis of decision-making processes that led to operational casualties influenced policy changes designed to protect military personnel from political decisions made by people who never faced consequences for being wrong. Elena's final contribution to military education came in the form of written materials that captured not just her methods, but her underlying philosophy about what military service should mean in a democratic society where civilian control required military integrity rather than blind obedience to political authority that might conflict with national interests. The curriculum she developed became a standard against which other programs measured themselves, creating competitive pressure for institutions to adopt similar commitments to truth and substance over appearance and political correctness that had historically compromised military effectiveness in favor of public relations considerations. Her influence continued in every student who chose truth over convenience, every leader who protected subordinates from political interference, every decision made with integrity rather than expedience that might advance individual careers at the expense of mission success or personnel safety. The ripple effects of her courage spread through accumulated wisdom that proved more durable than policy changes or administrative reforms. As Elena approached her 10th year at Coronado, the transformation she had catalyzed had become so thoroughly integrated into institutional culture that many new personnel no longer remembered how different things had been before her arrival. Honest instruction had become normal rather than revolutionary. Truth had replaced propaganda as the foundation of military education, and leaders made decisions guided by ethical considerations that previous generations often ignored. The woman who had stood alone during that graduation ceremony had never truly been alone at all, surrounded by the spirits of fallen comrades whose memory demanded nothing less than absolute honesty about the costs of service and the price of political games played with human lives. Elena's legacy lived in every operator who understood the difference between genuine service and political performance, between honor earned through integrity and recognition gained through compromise with principles that should never be negotiable. Sometimes the greatest act of patriotism was indeed refusing to participate in ceremonies that obscured truth rather than honored sacrifice, choosing instead to serve the reality that comfortable lies about military effectiveness and political accountability often forgot. Elena Vasquez had proven that individual integrity could transform institutions, that refusing to compromise principles could accomplish more than accepting convenient fiction, and that real honor spoke louder than words while living longer than the ceremonies designed to celebrate it. 10 years had passed since Elena Vasquez emerged from the shadows of her fabricated death to transform one of America's most sacred military institutions. The autumn morning at Arlington National Cemetery carried the crisp promise of change as she walked alone through rows of white marble headstones, each marking a life given in service to ideals that sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice from those who believed in something greater than themselves. The private section where her teammates from Operation Deep Strike were officially buried bore no names, only numbers that corresponded to classified records accessible to fewer than a dozen people in the entire intelligence community. Elena knelt beside the memorial markers, placing fresh flowers on ground that represented the final resting place of warriors whose sacrifice had prevented a regional conflict that could have claimed millions of lives. The weight of survival had never diminished, though Elena had learned to carry it with purpose rather than guilt. Each day of her continued existence was dedicated to ensuring that future generations of operators would not face the same betrayal that had cost her teammates their lives while serving political masters who valued expediency over loyalty to those who bled for American interests in distant places. The secure communication device that connected her to the highest levels of government buzzed with an incoming message that would define the next chapter of her extraordinary journey. Secretary of Defense Patricia Collins had personally requested Elena's presence at a classified briefing that would determine the future of American Special Operations doctrine in an increasingly complex global environment where traditional military approaches proved inadequate for emerging threats. Elena's reputation within the intelligence community had grown far beyond her official position as a training instructor, though her influence was measured in operational successes and lives saved rather than public recognition or media attention. The operators she had trained were serving in classified missions around the world, applying lessons learned through honest education that prepared them for realities that sanitized military training typically ignored. The Pentagon conference room where Elena met with senior civilian and military leadership represented the highest levels of American national security decision-making, where policies were crafted that would affect global stability and determine how America projected power in regions where diplomatic solutions proved insufficient for protecting vital interests. Secretary Collins opened the briefing with acknowledgement of Elena's unique qualifications and the transformation she had created within special operations training programs. The results speak for themselves, Commander Vasquez. Mission success rates have improved significantly while operational casualties have decreased across all commands that have implemented your training methods. The President has personally reviewed your proposals for reforming how we conduct classified operations. The classified presentation that followed outlined a new approach to special operations that emphasized political awareness, ethical decision-making, and protection of personnel from interference by officials who lacked understanding of operational realities. Elena's recommendations had been studied by policy experts who recognized that future conflicts would require leaders capable of navigating complex political environments while maintaining mission effectiveness. The proposal that emerged from months of classified deliberation was unprecedented in American military history, reflecting recognition that traditional command structures had failed to protect personnel from political decisions that compromised operational security and endangered lives unnecessarily. Elena was offered appointment as the first Director of Special Operations Integrity, a position that would provide her with authority to investigate political interference and protect operators from decisions made by people who never faced consequences for being wrong. The new office would report directly to the Secretary of Defense and the President, bypassing traditional military hierarchy that had historically protected political officials from accountability when their decisions cost lives in classified operations. Elena's authority would include the power to halt missions that had been compromised by political considerations and to recommend criminal prosecution of officials who endangered American personnel through negligence or self-interest. Elena considered the offer carefully, understanding that acceptance would make her one of the most powerful people in American national security while creating enemies among political officials who had grown comfortable treating military personnel as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving protection and support from the government they served. The position would allow her to prevent tragedies like the one that had claimed her teammates, while ensuring that future generations of operators could serve with confidence that their government would not abandon them when political considerations conflicted with operational necessity. The opportunity to create systematic change that honored her fallen comrades by protecting others was exactly what she had hoped to achieve through her years of service and sacrifice. "I accept the appointment," Elena said quietly, her words carrying implications that would reshape American special operations and potentially influence how democratic governments balanced civilian control with military effectiveness in an era where traditional distinctions between war and peace had become increasingly meaningless. The ceremony that formally installed Elena in her new position was conducted in private, witnessed only by senior officials who understood the significance of creating institutional mechanisms to protect military personnel from political interference. The oath she took was different from traditional military ceremonies, emphasizing responsibility to Constitution and personnel rather than obedience to political authority that might conflict with operational effectiveness. Elena's first official action was to establish protocols for investigating operational failures that resulted from political interference, creating procedures that would identify patterns of decision-making that endangered personnel while serving political purposes rather than national interests. The new office would maintain classified databases documenting political decisions that compromised operations, providing evidence that could be used to hold officials accountable for consequences of their choices. The transformation that followed was gradual but systematic, as Elena used her authority to protect operators from missions that had been compromised by political considerations while encouraging honest reporting of command failures that historically had been covered up to protect careers and reputations. The culture of accountability that emerged challenged traditional assumptions about civilian control and military obedience. Senior military officers who had spent decades navigating political pressures while protecting their own advancement found themselves facing scrutiny from someone who possessed both operational credibility and political authority to investigate their decisions. The comfortable relationships between political officials and military leaders who had learned to prioritize career advancement over personnel protection came under examination that had never existed before. Elena's influence extended beyond American military institutions as allied nations studied her methods and began implementing similar reforms that protected their own special operations personnel from political interference. The model she created influenced international discussions about military effectiveness and democratic accountability in ways that strengthened relationships between nations that shared common values about human dignity and governmental responsibility. The intelligence networks that Elena had built during her years of classified service provided her with information about global threats that required coordination between agencies that had historically competed for resources and recognition, rather than cooperating for national security purposes. Her unique position allowed her to facilitate collaboration that produced operational successes while protecting personnel from unnecessary risks. The memorial service that Elena organized annually for her fallen teammates had grown into a classified gathering that brought together operators from around the world who understood the cost of political interference in military operations. The ceremony honored those who had died serving governments that had failed to protect them while renewing commitment to preventing similar tragedies through institutional reform and personal integrity. Tommy Rodriguez, now serving as Elena's deputy director, often reflected on the journey that had brought them from that first day at Coronado to positions where they could influence global security policy. The woman who had endured systematic discrimination while demonstrating exceptional capability had proven that individual courage could indeed transform institutions when supported by people who valued substance over appearance. The classified reports that Elena submitted to the president documented patterns of political interference that had historically compromised American operations while endangering personnel who deserved protection from officials whose decisions were guided by career advancement rather than national security. Her recommendations influenced policy changes that strengthened protections for classified personnel while maintaining democratic accountability. Elena's private office contained mementos from grateful personnel who understood that her reforms had saved lives and prevented operational failures that would have damaged American interests while betraying people who had volunteered to serve in dangerous circumstances. The simple decorations reflected her continued preference for substance over ceremony, though the impact of her work was measured in global stability and lives preserved. The annual intelligence assessment that Elena prepared for senior leadership documented improvements in operational effectiveness and personnel morale that resulted from reforms she had implemented. Mission success rates had increased while casualty figures decreased as operators learned to recognize and avoid political traps that had historically compromised security and endangered American personnel in hostile environments. The training programs that Elena had developed at Coronado had been implemented throughout Special Operations Commands worldwide, creating standards for honest military education that challenged propaganda-based instruction designed to make political officials comfortable with decisions that cost lives. Her methods produced leaders who understood the difference between serving national interests and serving the careers of people who never faced consequences for being wrong. Elena's influence on recruitment and selection processes had expanded. Opportunities for personnel who possessed qualities necessary for special operations success, while maintaining physical and mental standards that ensured operational effectiveness. The changes she implemented challenged assumptions about who could serve effectively while preserving criteria that separated special operations from conventional military service. The legacy that Elena was building extended far beyond her official duties as she mentored young officers who would eventually assume leadership positions throughout the national security establishment. Her students carried forward lessons about integrity and courage that would influence American military culture for generations, while honoring the memory of those who had paid the ultimate price for political failures. As Elena prepared for retirement, after a career that had transformed American special operations, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from the beaches of Coronado to the highest levels of national security decision-making. The woman who had once been declared dead to protect classified operations had lived to create systematic changes that honored her fallen teammates while protecting future generations of operators from similar betrayal. The private ceremony that marked Elena's transition from active duty to advisory status was attended by personnel who understood that her contributions to American security could never be fully acknowledged in public forums. The grateful nation she had served with distinction would continue benefiting from reforms she had implemented while her example inspired others to choose integrity over expedience in decisions that affected human lives. Elena's final report to the President summarized a decade of institutional transformation that had strengthened American special operations while protecting personnel from political interference that had historically compromised effectiveness and endangered lives. The systematic changes she had implemented would endure beyond her service, creating foundations for ethical leadership and operational excellence that honored the sacrifice of those who had died serving imperfect institutions guided by fallible human beings. The simple inscription that would eventually mark Elena's own resting place reflected the principles that had guided her extraordinary journey from presumed death to institutional transformation. Honor requires no applause became the motto of the office she had created, capturing the fundamental difference between genuine service and performance of patriotism for public consumption that obscured uncomfortable truths about political failure and military sacrifice. Elena Vasquez had proven that individual integrity could indeed transform institutions, that refusing to compromise principles could accomplish more than accepting convenient lies, And that real honor spoke louder than ceremonies while living longer than the recognition designed to celebrate it. Her story became proof that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism was surviving when others expected failure, then using that survival to prevent future tragedies through truth that challenged comfortable assumptions about military effectiveness and political accountability. The woman who had stood alone during that graduation ceremony at Coronado had never truly been alone at all, surrounded by the spirits of fallen comrades whose memory demanded nothing less than absolute honesty about the costs of service and the price of political games played with human lives. Elena's legacy would continue in every operator who chose truth over convenience, every leader who protected subordinates from political interference, every decision made with integrity rather than expedients that might advance careers at the expense of mission success or personnel safety. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.